Like King Kong in 1933 and Star Wars in 1977, the Lord of the Rings film trilogy from 2001 to 2003 was a once-in-a-generation cinematic event that captured the culture's imagination and redrew the boundaries of visual storytelling. It was a technological and artistic wonder, marrying a variety of old and new techniques with a beloved fantasy novel that was said to be unadaptable, and yet, through a series of miracles, we were blessed with 3 films that became instant classics, and if anything, seem even more special today. But even the original team of creatives couldn't recapture that lightning in a bottle when they tried again 10 years later with the Hobbit trilogy. It was material from the same author, made by the same director, screenwriter, cinematographer, and scored by the same composer, but the result was, well, I'm not here to talk about The Hobbit. Those movies aren't completely awful, but it's hard to argue against the assertion that they're big misfires creatively, and they'll never hold the same cultural significance as The Lord of the Rings. Now we have another big-budget Tolkien adaptation, the biggest of budgets, the most expensive TV show ever produced, The Lord of the Rings: The Rings of Power. To say I was skeptical about this show would be an understatement. If The Lord of the Rings itself was considered unadaptable, then how much more difficult would it be to turn the appendices of that book, essentially a bunch of story scraps, timelines, family trees, and historical blurbs, into a show? It seems like a fool's errand.
There never was much hope. Just a fool's hope.
Not only do you have to flesh out a bunch of disparate chunks of information into a working narrative, you also have to try and please a fan base that's notoriously particular, while also making the show accessible to general audiences. Tolkien is known for rich and detailed writing. In fact, he's the guy usually credited with popularizing modern fantasy and mythological world-building in general. This leads hardcore fans to a tendency of being kind of nitpicky about adaptations. The history of Tolkien's fictional world has a lot of great stories and characters, but unfortunately the Second Age, the era Amazon's show has chosen to cover, is relatively light on that rich detail. That's good and bad. On the one hand, there's plenty of room for the show to carve out its own path and legacy. On the other hand, doing that is no easy task. For me, the most important barometer of quality for the Rings of Power isn't flawless fidelity to the text or adherence to my particular vision of what Tolkien's work should be. The most important question is this: does it feel like a tale that really matters, that sticks with you, that means something? That's the real test. When I watched The Lord of the Rings as a kid, I was bowled over by the sweeping visuals and the epic scope of it all. The movies still hold up visually for the most part, and I deeply appreciate all the filmmaking craft behind them. But all of that is no guarantee of a strong emotional resonance with the audience. As I've gotten older, it's the story and characters that keep it relevant and enduringly meaningful to me. The fact that the trilogy serves both the youth and adult in me is part of its timeless quality. And ever since I saw them, they've felt like tales that really mattered, that had something deeply meaningful to say, and said it beautifully. By that metric, and many others, the first season of The Rings of Power is incredibly uneven. And honestly, I think that might be okay. Lots of inaugural seasons stumble around finding their footing. Shows rarely reach their potential right away. This season laid a lot of groundwork for the future, which could have amazing payoffs if those storylines are developed well. At its best, the show was able to capture some of that unique and special beauty we got in Peter Jackson's films, whether it's the amazing landscape shots of New Zealand, the rich grandeur of Tolkien's cultures at their zenith, heartwarming friendships, or simple wisdom and courage in the face of overwhelming darkness. At its worst, it was an exercise in dull wheel spinning and irritating mystery box plotting that didn't properly explore certain characters and cultures, and did a lackluster job of setting them up for the rest of the story that's intended to last 4 additional seasons. I was pleasantly surprised by the 2-episode premiere. While some thought it was slow, I was kind of blown away by what I saw. Getting glimpses of the First Age, Valinor, and the Two Trees, really foundational pieces of Tolkien history, realized on screen, was a real treat. Galadriel, Elrond, Durin, Gil-galad, Celebrimbor, Halbrand, and even Arondir and Bronwyn were all introduced pretty effectively. The show gradually got better as it progressed, and by the end of the season, most of the characters and storylines had my interest to a greater or lesser extent. I didn't necessarily feel that way after my initial viewing, but on rewatch, I was able to gain a better understanding of what the show was trying to accomplish, despite being clumsy at times. The good stuff gives me reasons to believe that somebody in the production really understands Tolkien, and the bad stuff makes me worry that the writing staff might not be up to the task of translating the professor's outline into a strong show. The biggest problems with Season 1 are pacing and focus. This season is like an Entmoot. It takes a long time to say anything. That's not an inherently bad thing, but like the Ints, the show needed to realize that you shouldn't take a long time to say something if it isn't worth saying. I'm glad the show wasn't afraid to take its time with things, but I wish it had spent some of the time more effectively. With only 8 episodes, none of them should feel like unnecessary filler, but there are entire storylines that don't come anywhere close to justifying their length. Showrunners J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay promise more exciting future seasons, and knowing the source material, they aren't blowing smoke. There are really cool, meaty story beats to cover in the Second Age, but Season 1 often stumbles over itself with too much focus on mysteries that steal the spotlight from the show's strongest elements. I think the best way to talk about the triumphs and shortcomings of the Rings of Power is to break it down storyline by storyline. So, let's start with a good one. I love Elrond in this show. And I'm a little surprised by that, because he's a slightly dry character in The Lord of the Rings. His stoicism keeps the audience at a bit of a distance. Here, we get to see younger, bright-eyed Elrond, an Elrond who hasn't yet seen the courage of men fail. And I really like this guy. Robert Aramayo is great in the role, despite not being much like Hugo Weaving. His performance radiates with empathy and kindness. It's very appealing and sincere. At the same time, Elrond is a politician. He often has ulterior motives for his kind exterior. Making him a diplomat was really smart. Not only does it give us a window into elven politics and relations with other cultures, it echoes his role in The Lord of the Rings, bringing all the races together for the council without being an obvious retread. Elrond's storyline was the best, most consistently well-written of the season. It built the characters, the world, the cultures, and advanced the story in a way that was complementary and organic. The plot had tension and intrigue without needing violent conflict or theatrics. The plot point about the elves needing Mithril to survive in Middle-earth is a little bit contrived and might be the show's biggest departure from Tolkien's lore so far, but all the character work around that was good enough to justify it for me. I don't care nearly as much about changing the source material if there's good justification that pays off with strong characters and storytelling. Testing Elrond's loyalty between a good friend and his people was an effective conflict for him. It shows that he's an admirable man of principle who highly esteems honor and friendship. That's an apt trait for a Tolkien hero. Instead of a cool fight scene, Elrond gets his hero moments in dialogues. When he contritely apologizes to Durin, when he stands up to his king, Gil-galad, by refusing to betray his friend's confidence, or when he pleads his people's case before the Dwarven king. And you know what? That's a lot better than weightless superhero action like we get from other elf leads. Through Elrond, we meet Durin and the Dwarves. The film trilogy gave audiences a good sense of elves, men, and hobbits, but dwarves were kept to the periphery. Gimli, the dwarf we see the most, is leaned on for comic relief a little much, and his people's representation suffers as a result. Dwarven culture and characters finally get their due here. They're treated with dignity, but tempered with just a little bit of levity. It was a pretty perfect mixture for me. Getting to see Khazad-dûm in its glory days was a wonderful visual treat that didn't feel like a version of something we've seen before. Durin and his family are great, and that was definitely not a given. Things like Disa singing to the rocks could have come off as silly if not done well. Durin's relationship with his father would have fallen flat if not written and performed with the appropriate mixture of gravitas and humanity. All the dwarven culture stuff was great. It's one of the best elements of the show, and it's the best on-screen depiction of Tolkien's dwarves to date. Even though it might deviate from the lore, it captures some of the spirit. Elrond's friendship with Durin is so heartwarming to watch. I like how their initial conflict centers on the different ways elves and dwarves perceive time because of their lifespans. It's hard to get across a real sense of elven immortality, especially since the show is compressing the timeline so much. That was a very natural thing to arise between them, and a good way to reinforce the concept with the audience. My only complaint about this part of the season is the Balrog. It is far, far too early for the Balrog to show up, even with a compressed timeline. For the most part, this season is somewhat restrained, but this is one area I wish it had held back a little more. All we needed when Durin III threw the leaf into the mine shaft was an ominous glow at the bottom, or maybe we see the leaf burn up and hear a faint growl. A full-bodied reveal and roar at nothing in particular is excessive and silly. At the risk of praising The Hobbit, something like the Smaug teaser at the end of the first movie would have been more appropriate here. Still unnecessary, but better. These moments are in the show to remind impatient viewers that cool fantasy stuff is coming down the road. Please keep watching. It shows a lack of confidence in the material covered by this season, which is definitely a little warranted. If the show has a de facto main character, it's Galadriel. That's a sensible choice. Galadriel has special importance in The Lord of the Rings, but doesn't actually have much screen time. Exploring her character and history here is a solid idea, same as Elrond, but many viewers had big problems with how that's been done in Season 1. I don't think any of the blame goes to Moivrid Clark. She's terrifically cast as Galadriel. She looks the part, she sounds the part, she's clearly capable in the role. When the script gives her the right material, she's a wonderful Galadriel. But I'll admit that doesn't happen consistently. Right away, I got what they were doing with her character. She's been given the singular obsession trait common to so many protagonists. Her brother's death at Sauron's hands means she'll stop at nothing to find and punish the Dark Lord, even though nobody else seems to share her fervor. She's entirely focused on fighting evil. It's all she knows. From this state of obsessive myopia, she'll grow into the wiser, more somber presence we know from The Lord of the Rings. There's a lot more that can be done with her story, and we're given glimpses of greater dimension to her character, but this is probably going to be the essence of her story arc in Rings of Power. Making her care too much about pursuing Sauron is a decent way to give her flaws without disparaging her character with deeper moral failings. Though she definitely has other flaws, and we get hints of that elsewhere in the season, like in her conversation with Adar where she admits that she has a genocidal attitude toward orcs. Even though orcs are always shown to be bad guys in Tolkien's writing, that's a deeply uncomfortable and ugly notion with implications that ought to be explored at some point since they dared to go there. If there's anything that's revealed by that freakout moment in the Fellowship of the Ring, it's that Galadriel has dark ambitions that she struggles to suppress and overcome. Planting those seeds and probing those feelings in this story is smart, but some of the ways that her obsession is demonstrated end up damaging the character's intelligence and likability. At times, Galadriel behaves very, very foolishly for an elf thousands of years old with intimate knowledge of the world's history and cultures. She's driven but aimless. She possesses little diplomatic skill or curiosity about the world unless it relates to her mission. When Galadriel winds up in Numenor, she can't wait to leave to get back to her aimless Sauron quest. I desperately wanted her to exhibit a little curiosity about the rest of the world. Why is Numenor closed to the elves? Can she do anything to help restore relations? She only takes an interest in these questions after discovering another Sauron clue. This approach has the effect of making her not just a flawed character, but an unevenly written one. It undercuts the reality of her trauma by stripping away nearly all other traits. These notes ring very loudly for many people and can drown out the more subtle character work that was also present in this season. There is good stuff here, and I'd argue that there's more of it than bad. Ironically, Galadriel's interactions with Halbrand start to wake her up. She gradually becomes a more thoughtful, introspective character, instead of always hard charging at the next Sauron breadcrumb. After almost an entire season of Galadriel the Rash, Galadriel the Wise shows up in the last 2 episodes. It's a very welcome change. It proves to me that these writers are capable of doing her justice at times. This Galadriel comes off as a leader, someone who can inspire and be a light in dark places when all other lights have gone out. And that's perfect for her. If this is more exemplary of the Galadriel we get going forward, I think she could end up being one of the best characters in the show, which was not always the case this season. Galadriel's storyline takes us to Numenor, a hugely significant part of the Second Age, and an important piece of background for certain characters in The Lord of the Rings, especially men like Aragorn who trace their lineage back to the island nation. When this show was under development, there was a lot of talk about how much it would imitate Game of Thrones. Numenor is the only part of the show where it's okay to be a little bit like Game of Thrones. While I certainly don't want to see the kind of sexual violence and nastiness that show featured so prominently, political backstabbing and ambitious power grabs are perfectly suitable here. But we haven't come to that part of the story just yet. Numenor obviously looks incredible. It echoes some of the visual design from the films, like the Argonath and Minas Tirith, which is appropriate since the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor have their origin in Numenor. Numenor is Tolkien's take on the Atlantis myth. It's a great nation that goes bad, a nation founded on heroic sacrifice that ends up succumbing to its darkest impulses. The show's timeline compression makes this part of the story harder to get across. It's vital that we see and appreciate the good in Numenor so that we can properly mourn its corruption and downfall. It doesn't turn from the righteous path in just a handful of years. It takes generations for the rot to set in. Judging by Isildur's current age, we'll see all of that compressed into a couple decades in the show, maybe even less. I'm not saying this can't work, but we're not off to a great start. The battle for Numenor's soul has been so thinly and poorly drawn to this point. By the time we're introduced to Numenor, it's already been closed to the elves for a long time, and a kind of Numenor first attitude has taken root with the population. These ideas very much need exploration and explanation. Pharazôn gives a speech that's coded as anti-immigrant, and that's a stupid way to frame the issue. Elves aren't even allowed to visit Numenor, much less immigrate. How are they going to steal jobs or usurp political power? In the books, Numenorians grow jealous of the elves because of their immortality. But ultimately, it's not the elves they have an issue with. It's a group of demigods called the Valar, who gave them exceptionally long but still mortal lifespans. The Valar have been mentioned a few times, but not really explained. Maybe the writers thought that a human-elf conflict would be more relatable and would free them from having to explain the more esoteric parts of Tolkien lore. We're told about Numenor's previous king who was deposed from the throne after trying to return the kingdom to the old ways. That would have been a good conflict to see unfold on screen to help us understand the ideological divide. Instead, we pick up the story at about the latest possible starting point. Many of the Numenorian characters are underbaked so far. The best of the lot is Elendil. Lloyd Owen is well cast. He's credible as Aragorn's distant ancestor. His character is relatable, sympathetic, and honorable. He's a man caught in the middle on everything, with his kids, with his nation. He's trying to balance duty with personal belief, and circumstances making that difficult. His children reflect that conflict too, but they're much less likable, and their motivations aren't as defined as they ought to be. After spending a lot of time with Isildur, I don't feel like I have much insight about what he wants or who he is in this part of the story. He wants to go west, but the show hasn't explained what that means or why he wants it. His sister, who's an invention of the show, is posed to end up on the opposite side, which might be good for reinforcing the tragedy later on. I like what they're doing with this character from a strategic point of view in the narrative, but like her brother, I don't really understand why she's making her choices. Other characters like Queen Regent Miriel and her cousin Pharazôn are set up much better even with their limited screen time. Miriel, in particular, really comes into her own by the end of the season. Of all the topics explored by the show, Numenor is probably the most hurt by the split focus on numerous storylines. There's a lot of blink and you'll miss it exposition, lots of names and concepts that haven't been well defined or explored for the audience, and the overall pacing and structure of the Numenor plot is awkward and stilted. If there's one storyline I'd like to see the show nail, it's this one. Even though it stumbled out of the starting block a little, I think the show has a good chance of telling a decent version of the downfall of Numenor, and if it fails, it won't be for lack of grandiose scale. The Southlander plotline was my least favorite during my initial viewing, but I have to admit it's grown on me a little on a second watch. There's good stuff here, but it isn't presented in a very compelling way, and it takes a while to get any place interesting. Some of the individual characters and concepts are worthwhile, but unfortunately the story is framed around the fate of a peasant village full of men whose ancestors followed Morgoth, the original big bad of Tolkien's world. But who are these people now? Some of them still seem to have Morgoth cultism deep down in their bones, but why? What's Morgoth done for them lately? He's no longer around, and Sauron has been absent too. I understand why some of them would have animosity for the elves. They seem to regard these villagers with an air of condescension. They think these people are a bunch of dirty, backwater nobodies who will readily follow the next Dark Lord to wander over the hill. But they're kind of right about that. Why should we care about these people? What makes them compelling? Adar the Fallen Elf is an interesting character for his uniqueness. Arondir has cool elf energy, and I generally like Theo. There's something to that kid. I'd like to see more from all three of these characters. The construction and pacing of this season didn't allow them as much room to operate as I would have liked. We're supposed to root for Bronwyn, but she's championing a village that doesn't seem worth fighting for. In order to elevate her as a hero and leader, the rest of the townsfolk are written as spineless sheep without much initiative of their own. There are a few good scenes from this plotline across the length of the season, but overall, this part of the show fails to draw dynamic characters and conflicts or to structure its plot in a gripping way. In the end, it seems to have been in service of a twist that's all flash and no substance. Like, did Mordor need an origin story? Yeah, it wasn't always a volcanic ash heap, so what? In the Fellowship of the Ring, Isengard's transformation from beautiful forest preserve to industrial hellscape was impactful and meaningful. Not only did it serve a major function in the plot, it also represented Saruman's corruption on multiple levels, and tied in with deeper themes running throughout the story. It said a lot more than some dirty cultists unwittingly setting off a volcano, but at least this storyline had some impact on the overall narrative. I haven't brought up the Harfoots at all before this point, because they're so disconnected from everything else that you could easily edit them out of the show, and I think they probably should have been. I don't hate the Harfoots, but I spent a lot of their screen time vaguely bored, and that's not how I feel about the Shire portions of the movies. There's a fundamental problem with the proto-hobbits in this show. Hobbits never had much of an impact on broader world history. Until Bilbo, and especially Frodo, hobbits weren't seen as capable or important. That's why Frodo volunteering to take the ring is so significant to the themes and ideas of The Lord of the Rings. If the Harfoots get involved in the bigger picture of the show, it risks diminishing Frodo and Bilbo's unique roles in the later stories. Any adventures Harfoots participate in must be confined to their own corner of the world, or be of such small scale that they risk being boring in comparison to all the ring-making and Sauron fighting going on elsewhere. Generally speaking, I find their presence dubious. They aren't in this show because there's a worthy story to tell. They're here for brand recognition. It's the same creatively bankrupt impulse that causes some writers and directors to put X-Wings, stormtroopers, and lightsabers into every Star Wars project, whether it serves the story or not. The Harfoots miss the point anyway. Hobbits are appealing because of their simple, idyllic lifestyle, not because they're little people. That's about the only trait the two groups have in common so far. Harfoots are shown to be a bunch of nomadic jerks who apparently follow pirates' code. There were a few moments of this storyline that I found surprisingly affecting, though, and I enjoyed the ending. Sadoc's death was genuinely moving, and so was the way the community embraced the stranger. The prospect of Nori and the Mystery Wizard going off on an adventure to Rune next season is a lot more interesting than hiking the trails, singing summer camp songs, and occasionally threatening to exile someone. I didn't care for the portrayal of the stranger. It's one of the show's obvious mysteries that it dangles in front of the audience like a cat toy, except it's a really boring cat toy, a toy that cats wouldn't even waste energy to sneer at. For 7 episodes, the stranger is barely communicative, but then in the finale, he's suddenly speaking in complete movie quote sentences. It's very odd. It's very clumsy. Waiting all season for him to start doing something wasn't good TV. Season 2 should bring us official confirmation of his identity. I mean, I hope so. To keep the mystery going any longer would be pushing audience goodwill. My cynicism tells me popular consensus is almost certainly correct. The wizard is probably Gandalf for the same reasons of brand recognition. They all but confirmed this with the "always follow your nose" line. It makes a certain kind of sense for Gandalf to have met the hobbits first of any people in Middle-earth, although that's a direct contradiction of the lore. But I really hope it's another wizard. Any other wizard, really. Gandalf is one of those characters where overexposure risks ruining his mystique. Tolkien knew this. That's one reason he was constantly kicking him out of the stories, especially in The Hobbit. When Gandalf is around, everyone feels a little safer, which is why losing him in Moria is such an effective way of heightening the tension and raising the stakes. Bringing him back later serves to underline just how different a creature he is from everyone else in the story. Except for the other wizard, of course. Speaking of, I think the most suitable option for the stranger's identity is Saruman. Saruman is very similar to Gandalf in some ways, but with the critical flaws of pride, arrogance, and eventually cowardice, which lead him to serve himself instead of others. At some point in the next season, we're going to hear a name for the guy, and if it turns out to be Kuromo instead of Aloran, I think that would be a pretty good twist. Not for the superfans, but for the rest of the audience. I hope I end up pleasantly surprised by the Harfoot and Stranger plotlines by the end of the series, because so far, it's exactly how I thought it would be. Unnecessary and dull. To this point, they're the storylines farthest from being tales that matter at all. Finally, we need to talk about the Oliphant in the room. Halbrand, the show's secret Sauron. In the books, Sauron does show up in disguise and influence the elves to create the Rings of Power, but he doesn't do that as Halbrand, who is a completely original creation of the show. His other alter ego will appear in Season 2, so this isn't a substitution so much as an addition. It's an attempt to give fans of the books the same experience as people who don't know that other secret identity, while at the same time helping viewers more closely identify with the experience of the characters. It makes a lot of sense on paper. Showrunner Patrick McKay said they didn't want the first season to be the Sauron show. It would be very tempting to make the first season of this show the Sauron show, very villain-centric, but we wanted that level of evil and complexity of evil to emerge out of a world that you're invested in, not because evil is threatening it immediately. We wanted you to fall in love again with Middle-earth. We wanted you to understand and relate to the struggles that each of these characters are having before we test them in a way they've never been tested before. I think that's a very admirable sentiment, and in a way reflects Tolkien's writing. The lengthy first chapter in The Lord of the Rings is mostly about Bilbo's birthday party, with not a hint of evil in sight, except maybe the Sackville Bagginses. The movies reflect this too, presenting us with a pastoral portrait of the Shire, a place that we can feel invested in protecting from the evil that's revealed later on. But I don't think the show achieved the same thing here. The mystery-driven storylines don't give the characters the best chance to endear themselves to the audience. The locations are beautiful backdrops, but they don't convey a similar sense of community and hominess as the Shire. Instead of The Sauron Show, Season 1 largely became the Who is Sauron Show, and that is 100% the show's fault. They wrote and directed it that way. It's very deliberate. We know Sauron is out there. It's impossible to forget. The ostensible main character is spending all her attention seeking him out, and the show is happy to provide a list of candidates to keep us guessing. Is this Sauron? What about this guy? Or this one? Or one of these people? The showrunners used to work for J.J. Abrams at Bad Robot Productions. Abrams is famous for describing a storytelling concept he called the mystery box. For Abrams, mystery is the catalyst for imagination, which is why the unexplored and unknown drives a lot of projects he's been involved in. From Lost to Cloverfield to Super 8 to Star Trek and Star Wars, over and over, he uses some kind of mysterious question or event as a means of getting the audience interested in the story. But rarely, if ever, are the answers satisfying. They're not really the point either. Abrams sees the mystery box as a way to grab your attention so you'll come along for the emotional journey. But it's hard to get invested in the emotion of the characters when a cheap, obvious mystery device looms so large in the story and pulls so much focus. I won't say the mystery box can never work or it's always a bad thing, but it has obvious problems and is antithetical to Tolkien's style of storytelling. Tolkien was a philologist and a professor of Old English literature. His storytelling was greatly influenced by a love of language, myth, and poetry. He wrote a rich fictional history for his world, which was invested with a deep sense of meaning and culture. The mystery box approach was inspired by magicians. It's about manipulating the audience through flashy techniques. That style over substance approach is more akin to advertising than anything Tolkien was interested in. I don't think The Rings of Power is the worst example of mystery box storytelling, but it does seem more out of place here than elsewhere. And there's a general over-reliance on mystery as a way to grab the audience, which I think backfires, especially on initial viewing. It would have greatly benefited the show to have only one mysterious figure, two at the most. Despite this, Halbrand is one of the show's most compelling characters. He's charismatic and shockingly likable, but I'd argue that he's a lot more interesting once you know for certain that he's Sauron. On rewatch, these scenes take on new life and subtext. Armed with this knowledge, we constantly have to ask ourselves what his true intentions might be. There's a suggestion in Tolkien's works that Sauron might have been genuinely repentant for a time after Morgoth's defeat. Obviously, that doesn't last. Sauron is like a criminal, remorseful about what he's done, but unwilling to face the consequences. In refusing to submit to justice or make restitution, he ends up worse than ever before. If Halbrand is a hesitant, semi-apologetic Sauron, rather than a hiding in plain sight, scheming and calculating Sauron, that's a neat expansion on ideas from the original text. I think the ambiguity presented here is really compelling. Halbrand's scenes throughout the season are some of the strongest, including the sequence where Galadriel learns the truth, and we get a peek at Sauron's true power to manipulate. By the time of The Lord of the Rings, Sauron is too far gone, too consumed by evil to have much dimension left. He's a representative force in that story, more than a character. This is the right moment in the overall story to go deeper into his motivations and history. There's vast potential in exploring this villain, and we'll find out how much they're able to capitalize on that in the second season. Much more could be said about this show and its creative choices. There's a lot to appreciate, a lot to critique. I could go on and on nitpicking. There were tons of little things that bothered me, choices I didn't like, but I once felt the same way about the film trilogy. After I read the books, I got extremely pedantic about the movies, all the ways large and small that they deviate from the original work. In the years since, I've realized that adaptation necessitates change. There are different inherent strengths and weaknesses to each medium. There are people who can't get over the ways Peter Jackson's films differ from the books. They get stuck with one and only one telling of the tale, and miss out on all the good that the filmed version has to offer, including things totally unique to that version. Music, production design, performances, cinematography. The books tell a meaningful story, and so do the films, and I'm willing to give the Rings of Power every chance to succeed on those same terms. In the end, I want this show to be good. I'm rooting for it. There seem to be a lot of people who are doing the opposite, and I find that distressingly cynical. I'm not blindly cheering for the show. If I feel that it betrays the spirit of Tolkien's work, I'll be quick to criticize that. But I think most of the problems with the Rings of Power Season 1 are related to structure, pacing, and focus, not some kind of fundamental betrayal of the original author. At its core, the show has this tone of realistic optimism that's so powerful and palpable in The Lord of the Rings. The Rings of Power is by far the most meritorious of the Tolkien adaptations that we're likely to get in the near future. Since the first season premiered, the sleeping giant of intellectual property exploitation has awoken, and now the greedy, grubby rights holders have announced plans to further exploit Tolkien's fiction. There's an animated War of the Rohirrim movie that will probably be okay, most likely a harmless exercise in style over substance. But the two new live-action movies from Peter Jackson, Andy Serkis, and other returning collaborators are a lot more dubious. Those movies intend to bridge the gap between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings trilogies, whether there's a worthwhile story or not. Going back to what I said at the beginning, my criteria for a good Tolkien adaptation is whether it's a tale that really matters. And I just don't see how any of these other attempts to exploit the IP are anything but a desperate cash grab, a mandate of shareholders, not storytellers. If any of these other projects ends up good, it'll be in spite of a weak foundation. Out of all the Tolkien adaptations in the works, The Rings of Power, despite its flaws, has the greatest potential to become a tale worth telling. I sincerely hope it does.